Welcome to Renaissance Charge Videos. I'm Rick Friedrich, and today I am going to redo a video that ended up being 4 hours and 40 minutes and people were not going to be pleased with the length of that video, so I decided to redo it here. I'm going to give it a go, and it's really broken up into two sections, but I think I'm going to reduce each one of them and make it into one video. I was going to divide it up into two. Now this is about this Bedini book, and it's about the good and the bad in this book. So it's a review of this book, which I will endorse. I have endorsed, and I want to go over the details of that. Why am I doing that now? Because I do think it is important, and I also think it's important to know a pretty significant error in the book. The other reason that I brought this that I want to focus on in this video is because I've been personally attacked by Aaron Murakami, and it directly relates to the error in this book. Well, I guess it would be a little bit more indirectly, but it relates to the subject matter. Aaron Murakami posted a page on his website in which he writes, quote, Rick claims the, quote, loving paths, unquote, circuit was given to him by God. Here's a 1980 lab note of by John Bedini, the real inventor of the circuit, when Rick Friedrich was barely 6 years old, end of quote. It doesn't really follow his argument there. It doesn't make any sense because the lab note date has nothing to do with anything that I said about loving paths. So I want to get into that. You know, obviously I didn't claim that the loving paths circuit was from me at all. I don't really claim anything is from me at all. I'm not really an inventor. I'm somebody who passes on information. And the loving paths idea of making a spiritual analogy was my idea, and that's fine. I'm not trying to claim any ownership on it or anything. This is a spiritual benefit that I'm encouraging people with. So that he's attacking me, he's got a picture of me with a soother in my mouth, and that's silly. Maybe I am a baby in many ways, and I wish I was. I wish I could start over again. But anyway, I want to talk about that, but not so much of my controversy with Aaron, which is absolutely needless because we're supposedly pursuing the same goals, and we should be complementing each other in our work, not attacking. So anyway, I find the picture kind of humorous, makes me laugh, doesn't make me angry. But I find the mistake in his statement about the 1980 lab note very significant, and I'm actually glad that it happened because it shows that Aaron doesn't even know what he's talking about, and it shows that Bedini did lie by changing his lab note date. So I'm going to prove that today beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond reasonable doubt. But I don't want to get into merely criticism because Bedini had a lot of good to offer. Otherwise, I would have never been involved with him, and at least from the technology side. So John Charles Bedini, this is his. This was a note in, I guess, his obituary in the Coeur d'Alene Press 2.5 years ago. John Charles Bedini, 67, passed away unexpectedly on November 5th, 2016. He was born in Glendale, California on July 13th, 1949 to Rosalie and Alex Bedini. He moved to Coeur d'Alene area in August 1990 and was presently living in Hayden. So he passed away unexpectedly. And, you know, people have tried to suggest that he was killed or something, but I don't know firsthand any of the details because I wasn't involved with them for a while when he passed away. But Gary was expected to die. He was very sick in the hospital, and within 3 hours or so of his passing, I'm told by Jeffrey Miller, who talked to Peter Lindemann moments before he told me the story. They were eating in a restaurant apparently, and John just passed away. No particular dramatic detail about it besides not expecting somebody to pass away. So I don't understand why somebody would make a claim that there was something of a bad nature of that. He was older and he wasn't very healthy, and so that's kind of normal to happen. Anyway, it saddened me when that happened because I'd never been reconciled to him, even though I tried over the years. So this is not about my controversy with John, other than what my research has shown now, this video. My research has shown that his history is problematic in his timeline. And I'm going by John's own words. I don't need to go by anything else, and that's what I'm going to share in this video. But on the positive side, John did promote a lot of technology. He promoted unidirectional wave impulses, which is a fourth type of energy. You have AC, you have DC, you have oscillating currents, oscillating energy, and then you also have impulse. So both the oscillating and the impulse are confused with AC and DC, but they're quite a bit different. They have different set of laws. So I want to really stress that in my teaching now very clearly, to distinguish the differences. So John was a big promoter of the sharp gradient impulses. And so this book, 20 Bedini-Bearden Years, Free Energy Generation, Circuits and Schematics, which is produced by Tony Craddock's company. The Energy from the Vacuum series is related to this book as well, also by Tony Craddock. So now John promoted this, what people think of disruptive discharging, impulse technology, and ambiguously used the word radiant energy to imply that, more or less. And he also promoted the concept of negative energy, as he called it. And Tom Bearden was the source of that. We're going to look at, not the source of that particular, but in John's life, that influence came from Bearden, Thomas Bearden. So we're going to look at that connection later on, but I want to focus on the positive elements of this book. And then I want to look at some of the things that I have discovered or the major objection I have to just one small point. So anyway, you have this this book with in the proper beginning of this book starts after the 1984 book, which we're going to look at, and this is a provisional patent that is not like a regular patent. You can say whatever you want in your provisional patent. It's kind of like publishing an article. Anyway, what had happened in the history of how this book came about, I started becoming friends with John in 2004. And then by 2005, I already started a couple of these email discussion groups because the other ones were really controversial and just a bunch of bickering. So I had already replicated quite a bit of John's stuff. I had mastered the technology within 6 months, where I did not need to have any more knowledge about anything to have all my power needs provided. And that was just from the technology that John was promoting. And this was not anything secretive that he communicated other than what's all over the internet. So what happened was, one of the groups that I started, I think it was Bedini Monopole 2, John said, here, why don't you take this schematic here, which is now in this insert page in this book. He said, why don't you put that on the front cover of the Yahoo group? So he gave that to me, which was part of this provisional patent that was filed in 2003. So then, obviously, I worked on that circuit. In fact, here is the solid state version that I made way back then. So this is, wow, 14 years old now. Wait, 2005, around 2006. This book came about a year later. So I guess John was filming with Tony Craddock and then decided to say, hey, why don't you publish this, provisional patent. And in the course of time, they decided to add some various things, pictures on the back, and they added this article that I had found, the original, from the Atlantis Rising article. So this is my contribution to this book, was the schoolgirl article from Shawnee Bowman. Was 10 years old at the time in 2000, and John gave her the little schoolgirl circuit, and she won the science fair award, I guess. And there's a whole story behind that. So I contributed to that. That's my contribution to this book, as well as the first part of this book, which is the free energy generation book. I was publishing that for John. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So it was just like this one. This is another book that I published at the same time before this book was published, because I am a publisher as well. And John allowed me to reprint this book, which it was very small. It was about 34 pages in this book here. So Tony put it into this book, so that came from me as well. So the very beginning and the very end of the book was from me, even though it doesn't mention that. I don't expect it to. Anyway, I later contributed to the second edition too by correcting these schematics because there was some misprinting of the circuit parts and even the diagram. So we'll look over that a little bit later on. So the good part about this book that I want to focus on is this particular, well, either side. This is the motor version of the circuit, and this is the solid state version. So I want to get into that and explain why. And this is one that I just made the other day. So really, this is it without being in the black box. This is it exactly according to the schematic in here, except I had to add a capacitor. There is still a couple of mistakes in the circuit, or there are some error or omissions that I want to talk to you about, because I think some people, or probably a lot of people, have failed because they weren't like an application, or sorry, a patent is written for people who are familiar in the art. And I think that 99% of the people that were experimenting with these devices were not, even though they might have some familiar, they weren't experts in the art, so that they will fail. And so I'll explain some of those things in a minute. So what I want to do is go over just a couple of points. I went over a lot more detail, but I decided against it, sharing all that information because it's just far too long. So what we're doing is essentially we're creating a process here in which we are creating the negative energy. So the basic circuit, what it was called the simplified schoolgirl 2-battery circuit, creates the negative energy. You had the trigger coil, not the Hall switching or anything like that. It was just the trigger coil itself, which was a bifilar arrangement in the coil. In this one, we have 3 wires instead of 2. But you can still do this with the 2-wire coil arrangement. So you have this negative energy, which is called by various names in conventional theory, but it is called negative as well, and which now this is normally discarded and shunted out with a snubber system, flyback diode, what have you. And this is now redirected to charge a battery. So now doing this, we have a negative energy which has quite opposite characteristics than positive energy, which is what everybody's used to. And I've talked about that in my previous videos, so I'm not going to get into the details. But this gets into quite a bit of details from Bearden. If you can weigh through Bearden's some of his stuff I don't think is true. I'm not a physicist to be able to properly criticize Bearden in those matters, but I know him personally, and I've talked to him about these things. So some of the things I've called him out on, him and his best friend I met with once, Ken, him and Kem, and they started going off into some crazy stuff, and I just said, who you guys think I am? And they just stopped with their nonsense theories. I won't say what it was particularly about, but some of this stuff gets into stuff that I don't really know, so I don't have really a comment on. Others I think he's mistaken on, but there's a lot of good information in Bearden's material. Bearden, I think, basically gathered information from various people, like Don Smith was one of them that he certainly got a lot of information from. Joseph Newman was another one. And then, of course, Bedini he latched onto in 1984. And they became kind of like a team. So the Energy from the Vacuum book, which I have over here, that Bearden wrote in 2000, is the biggest focus in there is on Bedini. Anyway, the point is you got this negative system being produced, negative output. In the pad it's called back EMF. And now this is going to charge a battery, but instead now we're going to be charging a capacitor first. It's going through a bridge rectifier here. If you had the two wire coil system, you just have one diode. So you got a kind of half bridge kind of situation there. But the idea is you're getting a unidirectional wave impulse, as he called it, as Bedini called it. And so what's happening is it's a one-way. It's exactly like Tesla's one-wire system. It's a very abrupt, on time, very abrupt spike. And in this case, they talk about it being with running the motor or the oscillator at literally 1.5 to 2.5 watts. That's all the system will require. 23 gauge wire, trifilar coil, and 12 volt battery, 1.5 watts. And with that, you are charging into, say, 1 to 10 microfarad capacitor. You're charging that capacitor, and the amount of peak current is up to 300 kilowatts, not 300 watts, 300 kilowatts, peak pulses. And I was using John's his oscilloscope with the amperage probe to look at such things. So you could see when you really look at the peak pulse, if you have the proper equipment, you can see that. Now, this is what I've been trying to teach over the years, and I figure this will probably be one of the last videos that I need to do on the subject, because I'm pointing to a good source of information, which is in this provisional patent. And there's obviously a lot more than this, but how much do you really need to understand in order to make it happen? I'm not one that feels that you have to have a whole theory about how the energy works without being able to use it. I mean, you have to know the basics of the ins and outs and all that, but you can apply basic math to engineer this without having to have a graduate level degree in physics. Anyway, I do, as I said before, I have done videos where I've shown where Bearden has written me personally and referred to me even on his website correspondence as being somebody who was a key player in this engineering field. So even though I don't have a physics degree or training, but I have a hands-on experience. So what I want to share then is just kind of an overview and a couple of points. So the key here is that you have this negative energy unidirectional wave impulse like Tesla had in his one-wire experiments. And when you look at the what's so-called the hairpin circuit, which is really the impedance circuit, is what I call it, Tesla impedance circuit. Hairpin is completely misleading you into thinking that a curved loop has anything to do with what he was showing. It's really just a one straight wire. Doesn't matter if it was curved or straight. it's tapping two points along a very short conductor, stout copper bars, where he was tapping two different potentials. And it was due to the fast rate of change, not the high frequency. He was still talking about low frequency. So this motor allows for the same process. It's a mechanical oscillator, but it's more than an oscillator. It's a negative energy pump. So maybe let's call it a long term. Let's throw it all together in one phrase. It is a mechanical oscillator, negative energy, unidirectional wave impulse pump. That's what it is. That would be the best way to phrase it. Maybe that will be the title of this video. Because I want to focus more, promote the positive ends of this video than the negative ones. So now you have this energy pump that is creating this negative resistance effect in the battery. So the battery is being able to be charged, but before the battery, it now is a capacitor. Now this capacitor can change the negative to positive. And that's what I've been doing generally over the years, is charging these capacitors more positively so we can rotate the batteries around. And we've talked about that in previous videos, so I'm not going to hammer that subject. However, I will say this, there is some kind of ambiguity here, because in this is where Bearden wasn't a bench technician, so his writing was going back and forth with John on these matters, and John wasn't always the best communicator of sorts. And I think so there's some ambiguity in this book and amongst people trying to do these circuits, and understanding, well, if you charge up a capacitor with negative and the other side of the plate then converts, replicates the energy in a capacitor's setting, it replicates the energy on the other side of the plate, and it does so as positive energy. It draws in the electrons and so forth. And so now when you dump this capacitor, it's positive energy, but that is stated by Bearden that you can do that. The capacitor transduces. You see John draw diagrams in his videos, and he's got the capacitor, now it's positive. However, if you sharply discharge that that capacitor, you still have a negative. Every time you have a very sharp gradient pulse, this becomes an impulse. If you have a slow changing DC current, it's more properly pulsed DC. But once you have a sharp gradient, an on switch, an on off switch that are sharp slope, very sharp, very high spike, rather than triangle wave type of deal, then you have a different type of energy, a different set of laws, and we call this a impulse. And it's unidirectional like DC, but it's also different than DC because there's an environmental factor. It's an E amplifier effect, environmental amplifying, and that's what we want in a free energy system. That's what's necessary to create this. So if you have a triangle wave or a sinusoidal wave, you're never going to see this action trying to do the same things. So that's why in my resonance kit you'll see, for example, we use the square wave, and I use the gate driver to do very fast, sharp switching, and we do that with the motor systems too. And with the bifilar coil arrangement, it created the same very sharp switching. And The other factor that I want to mention is the negative result, the negative pulse result, which on the oscilloscope is merely the after effect, right? The oscilloscope is in its own loop. It's not actually, you're not actually looking at the circuit itself with the oscilloscope. You're looking at the loop of the oscilloscope. So the event is supposedly faster than the speed of light, in which creates this inrush of energy, because you have this potential, and it's like you've opened up a door for the briefest amount of time until the current flows. Once the current flows, then that stops that environmental inrush stops. So the idea is to create actually more frequency, which is this one will, the solid state or the non-motorized version is actually 25 kilohertz in this book. And the misleading part of this, not really misleading, but what people would assume is you have the same core. And really, this core is not the correct core for this circuit. So this circuit right here would have to have a ferrite core that could operate at 25 kilohertz, because when you run this, I just tried this out again, when you run this with the core that was used in the monopoles motor, they will only go to about 1.6 kilohertz, doing everything exactly the same. So you have to have a core that can go that fast, and that's where you're going to see a massive difference. So anyway, getting to the point that I went off on was, if you were having a trigger system where, I always make this analogy, it's like a pin pricking a giant. You know, it doesn't take very much energy. If you had a 30-foot giant, if there was such a thing, and you were a small person, child, what kind of energy would it take to prick a giant? And what kind of result would happen with this big giant being pricked? So it's an avalanche effect, I guess you could say. You've got all the stored energy there, and all you got to do is create a little trigger. And so this is an E-amp effect, environmental amplifier. So you're using this effect. This is very important to understand where the free energy comes from in the environment, right? Like we have this vast sun and its many rays, and we can capture it if we have the right trigger method, right? We're not violating laws of conservation, which, in my opinion, I don't see how you could call that such a thing a law. There's no way to prove that it is a law, the conservation of energy. It's impossible to prove that is a universal, but that's still not violating that idea by using environmental benefit. So when you think of a trigger, you have 1.5 watt trigger. That's what it takes to power the 555 timer, and the transistor and the various losses are going to be 1.5. Nothing to even worry about compared to the result. And now, instead of running it at 300 or 500 hertz cycles per second in the motor, now you're going to run at 25 kilohertz. So you're repeating this negative process, negative pump, a lot faster. because you don't really want any current there at all. And there might be some minimal current after the negative due to the arrangement of the coil, the bridge across the coil. There is going to be very minimal current that will come after the pulse. So you want to maximize this. Excuse me. And now what's going to happen now, the capacitor is going to charge up, but because it is low capacitance, it's going to be discharged. In fact, they say here to discharge it in 50 cycles. You'd have to have a decent sized capacitor to handle that. So I think some of these numbers are wrong. And by the way, before I forget, another thing to realize is that the value, the numbers of the parts numbers here are not ideal, and because you're not going to give away all your secrets, and so the specific values of the resistances aren't quite right. And you can, but they're enough there to get this thing going, and then you can tweak it from there. If you don't know at all what you're doing, then it'll be a little bit more difficult for you to learn. But if you understand circuitry already, it's easy to make the changes. So for one, the 2N3055 transistor is not really what you'd want to be using. And in fact, a MOSFET works a lot better with the gate driver, which is what I'm doing in my circuits right now. Very fast switching MOSFET. And then the bridge rectifier is just using the general 1N407, which is, it actually had said 1N408, which I corrected, and then Tony put it in the second version corrected. Although there was, let me see here, there's one diagram in here that I must have missed that's still mistaken. Yeah, on page 93, he's got the diode 1N408. And of course that didn't come from Tony Friedrich, it came from Bedini that way. So I think they put in there values that weren't, numbers that were not actually correct. They had the opto-isolator with the pins backwards on pin number 4 and 5 on the transistor side of the IC or the opto. And then the 2N35A4 is also not necessary. It's an expensive part that is completely unnecessary to use and actually creates a triangle wave, which is not what you really want, according to the whole theory here. So if you're trying to create negatively charged batteries, you're going to use the smaller capacitance, but you're going to still switch it very fast. In that sense, there's almost no point in using the whole capacitor pulsar at all. Just go straight to the battery, out the diodes. But what they were trying to do, which is not even reflected in the circuit, they say it in here that the 555 timer circuit is out of phase with the radiant oscillator circuit and remains that way under operation. There's no evidence for that in the circuit. The circuit certainly doesn't show that it's out of phase in the sense of what I mean by that, to get more specific, John had a patent capacitor pulsar where he would have the fill, dump, and they would be out of phase. So you would fill up a capacitor, and then you would disconnect the input and then connect the output in an oscillation manner. So you would have this total separation from the input to the output, and that's what he's talking about in here, but yet it's not reflected in the diagram. because if you have 25 kilohertz, oops, this one, 25 kilohertz, and you're dumping that at 50 hertz, then you're going to have an overlap. So they wouldn't be really out of phase. And you'd have to create some gymnastics here to try and at least start dumping it while the other input side was off. Now on this side, I could see where you could make that out of phase, but there's still nothing in this circuit that would ensure that. That would have to be done in addition. So the schematic isn't complete in all the details that's being described here. And that's why I'm drawing attention to these little points. Excuse me. So, yeah, just a couple of points here. I mean, you can look at the details. I don't need to go over. One point that he made here was that during the night, there's a different activity than during the day. And it's more beneficial at night than during the day. Don Smith talks about the opposite being the case because of the solar or the cosmic radiation having an effect on the nighttime as opposed to the... Oh, wait, no, that would be the same thing. Sorry. On the nighttime as opposed to the solar radiation from the sun. So he's making a statement there. Now, one quick mention here, he says negative, and he's got bracketed converging energy. So what he's meaning by negative energy is converging, the energy's coming in. And we use that term also to refer to other opposite phenomena than positive energy. So there's about 7 characteristics that I'm aware of that differentiate negative energy from positive. And why that's all the case, I don't necessarily know. So that's a few points. Regaging is in sentence defined as change of potential, regaging energy. So just some of these are things to understand when you're reading Bearden and this group of people, to know what they're talking about exactly. Because they use these words, they don't always define them. You have to kind of read around to see. Now here's another point. So I'm just saying a couple miscellaneous things here. Obviously, in physics, rigorously, power is defined as the rate of doing work, or the wasted energy too. Obviously, the power is developed in the local component performing the energy dissipation or change of form of the energy performing work. It is not developed in the flow of energy from the source. The very term power source is erratically and colloquially used, not rigorously used. To properly analyze a circuit, the energy flow without work, energy transfer without changing its form, which is regaging, must be clearly separated from the energy flow with work ongoing, energy transfer wherein its form is also being changed. So you have to distinguish when you're using an ammeter, you're measuring the rate of current, obviously, but the rate of dissipation of the energy. And so this is not referring to the actual inputs to the system, is what he's talking about here. So I mean, it's a passing note. I guess I could do a whole video on that, but and I don't really need to go into all this stuff. I don't want to share too much from the book so that it's like a copyright issue, or it's a reason that the video is a reason that you don't need the book anymore. So there is definitely some more information here. So anyway, I just wanted to point out the benefits of the circuit. And that I've used this for years. And, you know, make that a continuation of the teaching that I've been doing on the negative energy. And just to give, even though I give a positive endorsement, just because I had negative experiences with Bedini personally, doesn't mean that I disagree with many of his systems that he promoted. I disagree with him being the inventor. That I've come to learn over time. That was an ongoing experience that continues to this day. But that doesn't mean that the technology is false. Now, John wasn't very accurate in his speaking a lot of times. He was a storyteller, and the drama of the story was more important than the factual elements of them sometimes, let's just say. So I'll probably get into that in a little bit here if I decide to get into that aspect of it again.